In 2023, I made many 1% improvements that have massed to a bit of a change in the way I'm mastering records this year. So today I'm going to walk through start to end a stereo mastering session to detail each of the plugins, the processes, my decisions, and highlight some of these improvements I've made. So the session I'm working on is actually the stereo out from the stem mastering session I did for 4Eve. A bit confusing, but I've got a full video on the stem mastering session I did for them. Somebody commented saying, I'd love to see you master this as a stereo mix. So that's what I'm doing here. It's a really cool mix. And the first thing I do once I've signed off on a mix for mastering is I get it into Audio Editor because I need to detail a few little things. So what we go is we get the waveform stats, and this is going to show us the true peak level, which we need to find out, which I think is going to be 6.3, which I've got marked up here. And then the integrated loudness is negative 22.7. I want to know what is the integrated loudness at full scale. So when this is normalized and the peak is at 0 decibels, what's the overall range there, the dynamic range and loudness there? So negative 6.3 minus 22.7, some quick maths, that's 19.4. Now, again, this is all preparation that we do. Now, the next thing is the maximum short-term loudness. If we click this marker, it'll give us a time marker for 150, and that is the point at which it is the loudest 3 seconds of the track, the loudest 3 consecutive seconds. So it's negative 19.3 at 1 minute 50. So let's go to 1 minute 50. This is just all rudimentary sort of prep work I do on my masters. So that's there, beautiful. And what we're going to do is we're going to play this through this 3-second clip, find the true peak value, and then minus 6.4, because this negative 16.4 here, because if we're aiming for negative 10 LUFS, that's what we're going to do. We're not really aiming for negative 10 LUFS. I just use that as like a bar that I set a standard to, that if I'm working and I'm limiting, I know that if I'm softer than that, I'm pretty much out of the game. We've got to be driving much louder than that. The final master on this was like something like negative 4 LUFS, which is wild, but this is just rudimentary sort of prep work I do. So negative 16.4, we'll find out using iZotope Insight what is the true peak level of this passage. So what we do is we take this short-term value, which is 19.3, then we take away the peak value, which is 9, and then we take away the 6.4 value, which will get us to negative 10 LUFS integrated. Theoretically, it's not actually how it works, but this is just a barometer, and we get 3.9. So at the loudest section of this master, we'd want this passage here, this 3 seconds, to be about 3.9 LUFS. This isn't what I worked. I'm not working to that number. It's just a guide that I set here for when I start mastering. Now we can actually get into prepping for our first part of my mastering chain or process. Now, something I used to do in the past, now we're going to be using a standard clip here, standard clipper in hard clip mode. Something I used to do is clip before my limiter, which was good because what you'd do is you'd control rogue peaks just before the limiter, and that way the limiter didn't have to work as hard. But what I found is that by doing this, clipping before the limiter, any EQ moves I made, any changes I did prior in the chain would feed into that clipper. So depending on how you were clipping would actually change the tone of the master, which you've already sort of worked through. So now what I do is I elect to clip up front. And how do I set my clipping ceiling? Well, what I do is, again, in Audio Editor, this is just a guide to start from. We go to the declip function, and this just acts as a visual meter, and we try and find the peaks which we're going to chop off. So at about negative 10.5, we're just cutting off a few rogue peaks here, and it's pretty, even for a hard clipper, this is pretty minimal. You're doing about a dozen peaks over the ceiling consecutively, and when you put into perspective, there are 48,000 samples per second. 48,000 divided by 12 samples, it's fractional. So the amount that you're actually degrading the audio, even at that ceiling level, is very minimal. So let's set that up and then we'll have a listen. So we're going to go negative 10.5 here on the ceiling, and then we're going to come up 4.5 because I want the ceiling to be at 6. There's no reason why it needs to be at 6. It's just an arbitrary number I like to gain stage throughout. I don't strictly gain stage up and down between all my plugins, but it's just a nice number to have set going through. So if you want to swap things in and out, you can do so without too much of a jump in volume. So that's where we're at. Now let's actually take a listen to this before and after. It's just my upfront clipping, and let's take a listen.
ชัดเจนวันหนึ่งบอกมาอีกวันไม่อยากมาวันหนึ่งบอกรักอีกวันมาบอกลาไม่ชัดเจนความสัมพันธ์ไม่ชัด
You also got to remember this before and after on the hard clipping, these both have a negative 6 decibel ceiling. The before's at negative 6.3, this one's at negative 6 overall. So we're getting a huge bump in volume and we're only hitting that ceiling. Now, if I go to our loudest peak, which is at 1 minute 32, I'm pretty sure 1 minute 32, we can actually listen at the hardest moment at which this clipper is operating. So let's have a listen. Those 3 snare hits. Let's see if it's actually negatively affecting those snare hits. What we might do is we might just bring that ceiling temporarily down to, might copy this across to a B version to 0. It's barely making a dent in that snare, but we're getting a huge amount of volume boost. We're getting 4.5 decibels of extra gain simply by adding this clipper up front. Now, everything we do after this is just cream. So we got this first down. The next thing I like to do is listen through and get an idea for the dynamics. And by dynamics, I'm going to drop the listening volume and then listen for any little bits of pokiness or holes. So I'm looking for 2 things. The drums coming out too far, or a particular phrase or element coming out too far, or also another element being pushed too far back. So I'm looking at that or listening for that difference. We'll have a listen, and I don't know if we're going to use any compression, but it's really important just to listen at a soft volume, then hear for any of those micro changes. Now, I've dropped that at a low volume, and as I'm listening, the kick and the bass is actually super tight, super glued. The snare pops out, but I like the fact it pops out. It denotes a rhythm. If we squash that with a compressor, it's just going to make everything feel closed up. So this is an instance where stereo compression, I don't think, or just general full band compression isn't going to help this song along. It's actually going to go against it, because what's going to end up happening is you're going to be ducking every time that snare hits, and we don't want that. Something I did here, which I want to address, is the low mids. Like there's this, it's feeling a little bit like there's a little hole in the low mids. I'm talking about 200, 250 hertz, where if it was a bit thicker, everything would gel together because the vocals are at a good level. And what I'm going to do here is use the Michelangelo EQ. And I've done this before on the channel, but we're going to focus on the sustain of the low mids and driving a bit of grit into them just underneath everything, just to thicken things up. And the way we do that is in the controls, we're going to go across to the body, okay, of this mid channel. I'm going to scale this EQ so it's around 250 hertz. And we're going to dial in this sensitivity so the transients are sensing when there's transients and the body is body, so we affect the right portion of the signal. So let's just quickly monitor this. Okay, that's good. Now we want to just crank the shit out of the EQ and find a good pocket to have it in. Okay, I like that. I'm going to add a bit of drive to this overall. And then we're going to aim to boost this, drive it a bit, and then compress that body back in. So let's do that. I like that. Let's have a listen to this section here. I like it. It's subtle. And what I like to do is when I'm mastering, just do a very short snippet on loop, very short, so we can hear that exact tonal change. I'm going to change this output so it's level matched as well while we're at it. And I'll show you how I actually level match. What I do is I'll play a short loop like this, and I'll get the short-term loudness, which is 16.3 for that loop. And then if I turn this off, it's 17.1. So this output has to come down -0.8 to level match. Perfect. So that's good. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to monitor and listen to it in and out very quickly. Listen to that that pad on the downbeat. I'm a bit tone deaf, but that pad which comes down, listen to the low mids, it just thickens up slightly, and I think that's a positive interaction for this process. I like that. That's actually really nice. And this is just a little way to spot check the changes you're making as you're making them. Is just quickly loop things A, B, level match, and then keep moving. So that's the Michelangelo EQ. I'm actually really happy with that. Just going to have another listen to this passage here. Oh, what's going on there? All right. So the next one I'm going to use is the diamond saturator. The reason why I'm going to use the diamond saturator is there's this really cool setting Luca Predalesi shared with me in my interview with him.
Oh yeah, the first come to mind is the top little kick sparkle that I'm getting from distortion, and I encourage everyone that's diamond dynamic saturator to try that. So a perfect example is this. So if I do a filter and I do simply the 7K to 9K area, or let's say the 6K to 9K area. But anyway, I do just like imagine a little top. I do linear phase. I saturate in a dynamic mode, density 2, which is very snappy. And I do expansion. Now what's happening, like based on the envelope of the kick, I'm adding a touch of saturation just on the top of the kick, almost creating an extra layer of kick drum just for the top ends. And I find this very effective. And this came, I don't want to say by accident, but it was more like, okay, how we can just, now that we have this as a plugin, we can just make this as a great, almost sound design tool. And that was the case. And that's a good application for, again, for kick drum or snare drums, toms, everything that you want to add a little bit of saturation as a layer.
And it's this one here, and he uses it on mainly 808s and stuff. I've sort of adapted it to using it in mastering. And basically it adds this like dynamic saturation to the transients, and it makes kicks slap. Like it's a kick slap. And I love using this on electronic music because if the kick is a little bit round, a bit warm, and you want a bit more of a punch and slap in the face, this is a really good way to do it. The only problem with this setting is it makes things really bright. So it's sort of a trade-off. You want the harmonics, it gives you the harmonics, but then it gives you a ton of brightness and you have to end up toning it down later, which is a little bit annoying. You can compensate a little bit by adding a bit of a low shelf, which I might do, but I'll let you listen to this before and after so you guys can understand what I'm talking about. It makes the kick sound awesome. Like if we just highlight that kick, it makes it just slap. But you can hear how harsh things got, which isn't too great. So let's get a kick drum here. Really sharp top end. So we're going to add a bit of a low shelf. And then what we're going to do is we'll level match this quickly. So this way we're in a good spot. So what are we? Before we're at 16.2. Okay. And then after we're at like 15 point something. Okay. So we're going to bring this down a little bit. So that's a bit better level match. So let's have a listen. And what we might do is while we're listening, we might drop this down to here and level match the complete before and after. So this is so far the before and after. Okay, so with that, it's very bright, which I like the punch, I like the dynamics, I like how things are coming out and moving. Like there's a good depth between the thickness in the low mids and where the drums are coming out. We're going to do something with the EQ to compensate what we've done here with the diamond saturator, because as much as I love it, it makes things too bright. What we're going to do is first though, is we're going to use this is a bit of my favorite one here. It's the Meta plugin, and this is something I built, I think last year or the year before. And it's basically a 4-channel mixer with 3 processors on the side signal, which you can blend, parallel compression, harmonics, and what's almost like an Aphex vintage exciter on the side signal. I tend to not use the parallel compression on this one, but what we're going to do is we're going to just use the Aphex and the harmonics just to add a little bit of width to everything. It will also make things a bit brighter, which is probably not the direction we want to go in right now, but I just want to establish that stereo field, and then we'll dial back with an EQ after this. Now, you're probably also wondering why you EQing after all this. I tend to EQ after all of my sort of dynamic processes and harmonic processes, only because EQing into a compressor, like I said at the start of the video, moving into a clipper or anything dynamic, it's going to mitigate or it's going to scale the effect of your EQ. So if you EQ into a compressor and you're compressing down hard, if you did a 2 decibel boost and you're compressing everything down, that 2 decibel boost becomes a 1.5 decibel boost. I don't like that. I like my EQs to be open after all this sort of processing. So what we're going to use is here is the 432, and we're going to give the low end a pretty big freaking boost. Now, you're probably wondering what this curve is, and this will all make sense. This curve here, this low, this high, this mid curve, is actually as closely matched as I could, the low, mid, and high curve of the God particle EQ. And the reason of that is because I actually like these meters here, these level meters on the God particle, for just general RMS overall tone balancing. It's actually a really good tool. So what I end up doing is, or what I'm going to do is, I'm going to show you how I use the Sontec into the God particle. I usually have this amount at 108. I don't use a limiter on the God particle because I like to have a little bit more flexibility after this, but I will aim to drive this God particle so it's hitting all of its targets, and it gives me a really good even balance. Now, a few exceptions to this rule. Sometimes the God particles meter for the low end is far too big, like far too big for some tracks, where if you're hitting the low here, the amount you have to crank the low end with a shelf is huge and it's not balanced proportionally. So you can't always rely on these meters. Likewise with the high, you should never ever see any high signal on here. If you do, it's probably too much. And if it's not, you need to use your ear to adjust the top end. I just mainly use it for this mid-range and overall level hitting in, and it works a treat. It's actually pretty magical. I got a full video walking through the behind the hood scenes of this guide particle. But this is something new that I sort of started doing. And even in my mixes, it's really a good way to start getting my mix bus set up. So we'll play through to this guide particle and then we'll adjust these EQ bands as necessary. These EQ bands aren't active. They're not active because I just want to monitor this section here. Now what I'll do is I'll show you a before and after of this Sontech feeding into the guide particle, level matched to the original. So let's do that now. See what I mean? See what I mean? It pushes you to drive that low end a bit too fast. So I'm just going to back it off a decibel. I'm going to give half a decibel back to the top end here. We'll level match and then we'll try again. Come on, that is, the snare sounds crackier and grittier. Everything sounds more punchier and coming out of the speaker, even though that one at the top is 7 decibels louder than the one below because I've level matched it. That's pretty wild, and I still haven't done my final process. So now things are getting juicy. Not only have I controlled the dynamics at the start with some hard clipping, I've managed the dynamics in the way I've wanted to. I haven't had to use any bus compression, which is great. All I needed to do was boost those low mids and compress them slightly using the Michelangelo EQ. And the Diamond Saturator did all of this sort of punchiness or flavor to the overall master, which is nice. Now, the Michelangelo is pretty new to my process in 2024, and this is mainly what I'm using it for, is just getting the thickness in the low mids. Some of the other bands I still got to do a bit more experimenting with, which is perfectly fine. And also feeding the 432 into the guide particle has been working wonders, just absolute wonders. It also exposes some of my weak points when I'm mastering, and sometimes it's just rubbish. This doesn't work together really well, and I'm like, no, this isn't for the track, and I just trash it and go back to basics. But for general pop, EDM sort of stuff, this is a pretty good combo. Now, when it gets to this stage here, I'm doing one of two things. Either I want to move the needle even further and take it through my analog chain, which I tend to do for a few reasons. Now, I'm not doing it on this track because it doesn't call for it, but if the subs are a bit wild and crazy, I don't know why, but going through my analog chain adds a really nice glue to especially things like rock tracks or contemporary like country pop sort of stuff. sometimes even with electronic music, but not for this case in particular, I'll run it through the analog chain. The other reason is if I want a very specific type of limiting, the limiter on the Varimu has a very sort of snappy peak. So even though it gels the body and makes everything gooey and glued together, the peaks come through in a really nice way. But in this circumstance, I'm actually really happy with the dynamics and the tone. So you might question what I'm going to do right now, and that's actually use Ozone Assistant. Now, Ozone Assistant, I don't use for the sake of being a quick fix. I use it as a checksum, as a, hey, what do you think? Did I miss anything? Now, I'm listening the entire time and making decisions based on the material, but I'm human, and this sometimes comes up with great ideas, and sometimes, well, a lot of the time, I don't use it at all, but I like to run it anyway. It's just part of the process that I like to do. So let's have a look.
จะไปเล่นไหนนะไปกันไลฟ์บ่อยใจงี้ก็บ่อยๆเอาแต่ให้ฉันต้องคอยเอาพี่ได้ชัดหน่อยอย่าปล่อยให้
This is the fun part. When it searches for enhancement, the whole computer just like completely clogs. Because it's all algorithmic. It's not searching for enhancement. It's just trying to match numbers. And then it's going to spin super fast because they put this... I don't know why Ozone put this graphic in. It's like, why? Just give me a progress bar. I don't need any animations. All right, so this is definitely an EDM song. I sort of look at it here, and this is where I go, Ozone Assistant, what do you want about? It wants way more sub. It wants another 1.5 dB of sub under 50 hertz, and that ain't happening. It's telling me to pull back the low mids, which I can't agree with, and it's asking to add more top end. And this is one of the circumstances where I use Ozone, and I'm like, sometimes there's merit. Sometimes there's merit. And what we can do is we can just solo this and see what it sounds like on and off.
จะไปเล่นไหนนะไปกันไลฟ์บ่อยใจงี้ก็บ่อยๆเอาแต่ให้ฉันต้องคอยเอาพี่ได้ชัดหน่อยอย่าปล่อยให้รำ
That's way too big. Way too big. No, I'm not using that. The impact, I'm happy with the dynamics. I don't need that. The imager, I'm happy with the stereo. The clarity module, I don't use that much. The stabilizer, I do use. And because this track is pretty harsh in the top end, I also use this high module here for de-essing. But because this diamond saturator has made things a bit edgy, this will just soften some of the top end really nicely. We'll take a listen. Turn it off.
จะไปเล่นไหนนะไปกันไลฟ์บ่อยใจงี้ก็บ่อยๆเอาแต่ให้ฉันต้องคอยเอาพี่ได้ชัดหน่อยอย่าปล่อยให้รำบ่จอยวันหนึ่งเธอก็บอกรักกันอีกวันไม่ให้ความสำคัญ
Very subtle amounts. It's just if it gets a bit too exy, this is going to step in and help compress it a little bit, which is nice. The dynamic EQ, now this is a little trick I do. Put it in the delta mode and then solo each of these bands, because when I play this, you're going to hear some of the transients of the drums start to get sucked away. That's the knock of the drums. That's the knock of the drums there. We do not want to get rid of that at all. So we're going to turn that off. And this maximize, I just fuck off because I do something a bit more special than that is we're going to use the vintage limiter first. And I'm going to show you and tell you exactly what I'm listening to here. So we're going to loop the loudest section. Remember how we made this cut for the very loudest section? This is where our limiters are going to work the hardest. They're going to be struggling to release without distortion the most. We monitor the delta signal, and I'm going to bring this threshold down. And as I bring this threshold down, it's okay if I start to hear a pulling away information. What I do not want to hear is a pulling away too much low-end information. I want my low end to stay big and fat. And if it's pulling away that information, it's going to start to thin out and squash the overall master. Listen to the delta, listen to the threshold. This is the first limiter I use and how I use it. Let's go.
ให้เล็กน้อยนะไปกันไลฟ์บ่อยให้เล็กน้อยนะ
That's good. Now, maximizer. I do the same thing, delta. I tend to start with either balanced or transient. I'll give you an example. I'll tend to use transient when I know there's too much low end in a track and I want to tame it a bit. Because it's got more aggressive settings, it will take more low end out when it's pumping more. That's not a bad thing. It's a useful tool to understand. Whereas the balanced and the classic don't tend to take out as much low end because they're slightly slower algorithms. So let's have a listen to the delta and we'll bring this gain up. And this is going to get loud because I'm going to bring the volume back up. And let's just see what integrated loudness we got here. Okay, so for this style of song, we do want a little bit more loudness. We're hitting about negative 6.3. And this is where I'd go, you know what? I'm going to use the transient mode, sacrifice a little bit of the low end, which I think we can in this circumstance, for the sake of driving a bit more gain, which this particular mode tends to do better. I'm going to go 4.5. Let's have another listen. That's sounding really good. Now, what we need to do is add a true peak limiter. Let's go here. Maximizer. And this is just a little trick I learned from the Ozone team. They actually suggested using a second series of maximizer, IRC1 in true peak mode after the fact, and it works perfectly fine. So we get a 0 decibel ceiling. Let's have another listen. So what I did is I level matched the loudest passage in this track between the before and after, so negative 14.5 decibels. Now let's listen to what it was like before, and then we'll flick over to after. You can hear just how much bigger and warmer the after version is, and that's how I'm mastering in 2024. The little quirks, the 1% changes, if you didn't pick them up, were clipping ahead of time. Number 2 would be definitely running this 432 into the God particle. And number 3 would be the Ozone Assistant, just to give me a few little pointers. And in this circumstance, it didn't really work out. I trashed most of what it gave me. But for what I did leave, I left the dynamic EQ, where I did think it found some nice little spots in the lower and the upper mids, which are a little bit pokey and holy. Hope you enjoyed that. And until next time, take care.